Today I've got a Voigtlander Bessa 1 camera. This one's come to me because the shutter needs to be serviced. It just doesn't work well. And if we set the shutter on the 5th of a second, it did close eventually, but it was much longer than a 5th of a second. So the first task really is to remove the shutter from the camera. Focus, I notice, is quite stiff on this too. The easiest way with this particular camera is to start loosening that retainer ring with the camera closed. It's much easier to get at the retainer ring with the camera closed in this case. Now I've got this tool, a lens spanner. I've got the round tips on here, and that's so I haven't got a sharp edge, so that if I slip off the retainer ring, that I don't cut through the bellows with a sharp edge. That's turning quite freely as these things go. It seems good. I'll open the front slightly so that there's somewhere for the shutter to go, and I'll just rotate that ring with a pair of tweezers. There's a bit of resistance on this, and I would suspect that there's actually dried grease or oil on the threads that is making that sticky. Two things you've got to be very careful of here. One is the bellows, as I've already mentioned. You don't want to slip and puncture or tear the bellows in any way. And the other, of course, is you have to be very careful not to slip and scratch or chip the rear lens. Here we go, shutter's loose. Now I can lift that out of the body. So in this case, we've got a Synchro-Compur shutter and a Color-Skopar 105mm f3.5 lens. Focus is quite stiff. There's no notches on the lens at the back there for unscrewing that lens. That'll have to come off with a friction tool, I believe, and that's where I'll start. Let's try this. Yep, that was the tool to use. That's unscrewed very easily. I'll put that down on a tissue because the glass is proud on both surfaces, so I don't want to just drop that down on my somewhat grubby work pad. And I can remove the shim at the back of the shutter. I'll just do that screw up tight so I don't lose it. That's good. And at the front, I can see 3 small screws around the outside diameter of that focus scale ring. So I'll loosen those and see if it gets us in. just loosening the screws. I'm not removing them. They're only small, those grub screws, and that means that they're very easily lost. I can see that that's going to lift off. I'll slacken those screws off a bit more, and the focus scale ring comes off. I'll pop that to one side. We can remove the front lens group, and here we've got to remove this. There's nowhere to engage a tool on that. I'll try a friction tool first. If a friction tool fails, the next best choice in a case like this would be file a tiny notch either side and then engage a rule or some other tool across there to use as a spanner to get it off. I certainly do not want to put a clamp of any sort on here to try and grab that to unscrew it. The brass is fairly thin, it's fairly large diameter. There'd be a high probability that I would distort that and then never be able to get the thing off. So a friction tool, first choice. Let's try this one. No, it doesn't get to it. Yes, that did it. So that's our central group out. And now just about into the shutter. So what have we got here? With the front retainer ring here, bayonets on. It's locked in place with a little half head screw. I'll just rotate that out of that notch. That will allow me to rotate the bayonet mount and it should lift off. There we go. It's a bit sticky. It's all chrome brass, these parts, satin chrome, nice and pretty, very easily scratched. So you don't want to dig a tool into it or attack it with a screwdriver or a lever to try and get that off. You're in danger of making a mess of it. So this is a bigger shutter than I'm normally dealing with, because normally I'm dealing with the smaller size on 35mm cameras. We can remove the speed ring, speed setting cam. Now the shutter release here has a tiny spring involved in it, which is a bugger to get right from memory. It hooks over a little pin underneath here where you can't see it. Lift it off its post, yes, and I was able to unhook the spring. And it's just quite a fine spring, but it just hooks over a post which is hidden underneath that lever, just for good measure, just to make life awkward. I'm going to remove this lever at this point because our main spring for the main lever is fixed over a post down there and you can't see it at the moment. That's good. Just needed that to fly off into the distance. And this piece with its complicated springs, that'll be fun to put back. Right, now I can see the main drive spring there. I'll unhook that from its post, or at least attempt to. Yes, that's easier said than done. That's better. I'll wriggle this out. There's a tab here on the main drive ring which charges the delay action on these shutters. That's prone to getting trapped underneath. All of this is quite sticky. It's see, there's that lever there trying to get caught in there now. Yeah, all of this is quite sticky, which is almost certainly down to dried out grease. That's okay, we've got that off. So what do we got here? Well, this is our self-timer or delay action. This is our retard gear train. I think both of those can be cleaned in place on the mechanism plate. I don't see any special need to remove those. Our piece here, this is for our synchro. This is for doing our flash synchro. We have X and M. X is basically makes the contacts when the blades are fully open. On the M setting, the contact makes before the blades reach the fully open position to give time for your flash bulb to start burning at peak intensity. I'll zoom you in a bit. Let's have a close look at some of this. Where was I before I was so rudely interrupted by the telephone? Okay, this is the flash sync mechanism here. Need to take great note of where the springs go, which side of the posts the springs go around, and other such useful features. I will start at this end. Lift off our flash sync lever. There's the return spring for that. It's sitting on there. It doesn't want to come off at the moment, but it will probably fall off when it feels like it. Another screw at this end. I'm sure that holds this thing down. Let's have that off. Yeah, it's lifting off. The top plate should lift off with a bit of luck. It is. That's our 1/500th of a second speed spring there. That provides the extra power to make the shutter run out to 1/500th of a second. So there's the top plate. These standoffs that the thing stands on, both of them are loose. That's a funny triangular shaped piece at that end. I'll remove the flash contact. Single screw in this case, holding the contact to the mechanism plate. Here we have the sector gear and the pallet wheel. I'll unhook that from its post if I can. That's quite a strong spring. Of course, when I finally get it off, it's probably going to zoom across the room. Is it easier to get off at the other end? Possibly. No, it's not looking very hopeful. I'll lift the whole arm off, spring and all. There's a little wheel that drives the pallet wheel. The pallet wheel is here. That's fixed to the base. So is the pallet. So neither of those pieces leave the mechanism plate. Right, so that's the parts off the mechanism plate that we need to take off to service the shutter. From the back we have 4 case screws which hold the shutter case to the mechanism plate. They're probably identical. I'd be surprised if they're not. They're the same as the screws that Deckel used on the smaller shutters of a similar design. Except the smaller shutters tend to have 3 screws instead of 4. Alright, so we've got it split now. Here we have the shutter case with the diaphragm mechanism in place. This is fairly stiff to move. That's not necessarily a disadvantage. You don't want to accidentally knock your settings and move them. But the blades need to be clean. I'm not seeing any sign that they are sticking together with anything. There's no obvious oil there. The mechanism plate. For the underside of the mechanism plate here, with 5 blades. I'm just looking to see if there's anything odd about them. All looks good. I'm seeing where the first blade was fitted, and the first blade was fitted at this point, which is at the this end of the delay action, and then the blades went round in a anti-clockwise circle. I'll just lay those out in the order they come off, and then I can look at them closer and make sure there are no differences between them. The tip of 1 or 2 of those blades have the tip altered on them. They're altered so that they tend to lift the tip of the blade so that the blade will slide over the other blade next to it easier. So they do have to go back in a certain order. I'll make note of that. The mechanism plate here. Right, so this lever swings backwards and forwards and it operates the blade actuating ring. The blade actuating ring is this component here. These are the fixed pivots for the shutter blades, and these are the moving pivots on the outside. And as they swing backwards and forwards, they swing the blades in and out. So we have 4 screws, well only 3, hold the retainer plate to the back of the mechanism plate. Two short ones there. These are often different lengths and shutters, so you need to take note of which screw went where. And a long screw there. Where they've used short screws, it's because if they'd used the longest screw, it would protrude through the mechanism plate and foul some piece of the mechanism. So that's the retainer plate off. Here's the blade actuating ring. And here's the mechanism plate stripped down as far as I'm going to strip it. I don't normally remove the retard gear train from the mechanism plate. I usually clean that in situ. If you take that off the plate, you can have a great deal of trouble getting your speed set up accurately afterwards. So leave in place, it can be cleaned in place, that's not a problem. It usually doesn't require a hell of a lot in the way of cleaning anyway. And this is the delay action here, and that'll be flushed with naphtha. There's no obvious problem with that, that looks quite good. So that's our mechanism plate disassembled. And here we have the shutter case and diaphragm mechanism. I'm looking at this, there's two holes through the retainer plate here, and here you can see the screw heads. Well, those screw heads actually attach the moving plate inside here with this lever at the back of the shutter. So we can get to those screw heads from this side, which is great because it makes it much easier to reassemble the diaphragm when you're not having to try and when you can assemble this whole mechanism in one piece and get the case over it and screw it down. It's much easier than having half the mechanism fitted to the case and lowering it down over the blades, although that certainly works. Well, so far so good. Now at the f3.5 mark on the shutter, the blades are fully open. That aperture is completely open. It's important that I note that so that I get everything back in the correct position. So far so good. I'm going to remove the setting lever from the back of the diaphragm first. So I've got to line those screws up with the holes in the retainer plate here. So I can see a screw head there. It's quite reluctant to unscrew. It suggests that it might be riveted over to some extent on the other side. I'm supporting that plate on a pair of tweezers there. So I've got to apply a fair bit of downward pressure to that screw to make sure the screwdriver doesn't cam out. And the same on this one. Yeah, the lever falls away. There's nothing obvious about it. It doesn't look like those screws have been riveted over to any extent. I think they were just screwed in tight, and they may just possibly have a hint of corrosion which has helped lock them in place. Alright, so now I can lift off let's open that right up. So we can see that's the maximum aperture that you see. You can see that the hole is completely uncovered there. That's at the f3.5 setting on the scale of this shutter. So I'll remove the 3 screws here. I'm looking to see that if they're identical. On some of the smaller shutters, one of the screw heads is countersunk, presumably because they needed to clear something on the mechanism plate. Checking to see if that's the case here. Doesn't appear to be so. Those screws look identical. I'll lift the retainer plate off. Now this side of the retainer plate goes to the shutter, and it's got 5 little indentations on there. That's where the shutter blades sit, or the pivot for the shutter blades would sit. This side will be dead flat, that's plain. That goes towards the diaphragm. And there we have our blades. You can see that the blades are all laid out there clockwise actually. I'm going to tip those out. Here's the moving ring. This has the slots in it. Just looking at the state of this, this is all quite clean. There's no obvious problem there. And these blades likewise look pretty clean to me. Nothing sticking to each other. Often when you disassemble something like this, the blades are actually stuck together. These ones are not. So there was no oil on those blades to speak of, though they'll probably benefit from a clean. So looking at the state of this, the shutter blades were fairly clean. There's no sign of oil on those. The diaphragm blades are fairly clean. So any stiffness in the setting of that diaphragm was probably friction, most likely, between the setting lever here and the case at the back, and probably nothing much more than that. And that was causing no problem, of course, because you don't want it to be too loose. The shutter blades are nice and clean by the looks of them, and they'll benefit from another clean, but they look okay to me, so they weren't causing any problem. The blade actuating ring has got a bit of a dirty look to it. It's quite possible that there was some dried lubricant on there that was making that sticky and sluggish and reluctant to move. The retainer plate here doesn't look too bad, perhaps a little bit grubby. And that brings us back to the retard gear train here, and potentially that was slowing things down a bit. If that's the case, quite likely that'll be fixed when that's been given a good clean. Right, I'll start cleaning things up.